Nathaniel Pierce pushed open the door to his office, expecting the usual pristine order of his workspace. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, curled up on the luxurious leather couch, was a woman, his secretary, fast asleep. His sharp blue eyes narrowed as he took in the sight. Her dark brown hair spilled over a stack of files, her face peaceful, her breathing soft. She looked completely at ease, as if this billion-dollar office was her personal sanctuary. A slow, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Nathaniel didn't smile often. As CEO of Pierce Global Enterprises, he had built his empire on discipline, precision, and an unshakable reputation. There was no room for distractions, no time for foolishness. And yet, here was a distraction in the form of a woman who had somehow managed to fall asleep in his office. His secretary, Sophie Monroe. He had hired her 2 weeks ago, and in that short time, she had proven herself capable, efficient, and unfazed by his notoriously high standards. She was nothing like the assistants before her, those who had either quit under pressure or tried to flirt their way into his personal life. Sophie was different. She was serious, focused, always professional, but right now she looked soft, vulnerable, intriguingly out of place in his world of ruthless business deals and high-stakes negotiations. Nathaniel took a step forward, his expensive Italian shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor. He should wake her, he should demand an explanation, but instead he just watched her. His gaze traveled over the curve of her cheek, the way her lips were slightly parted, the delicate rise and fall of her chest. He had never looked at her like this before, not like a man looking at a woman, but he couldn't help himself. A strange warmth settled in his chest. Then, as if sensing his presence, Sophie stirred. Her eyelashes fluttered, and within seconds her hazel eyes snapped open. She bolted upright, panic flashing across her face. "Oh my God," her voice was hoarse from sleep. "Mr. Pierce, I didn't mean to." Nathaniel crossed his arms, raising an eyebrow. "Sleeping on the job, Miss Monroe." Her cheeks turned bright red as she scrambled to straighten her blouse. I stayed late to finish reports, and I guess she pressed a hand to her forehead, looking utterly mortified. "This is so unprofessional. I am so sorry." Nathaniel should have been irritated, should have reprimanded her, but instead he said, "You must have been exhausted." Sophie blinked, clearly caught off guard by his lack of anger. Well, yes, but it's no excuse." He studied her for a long moment. "When was the last time you went home at a reasonable hour?" She hesitated. That was answer enough. Nathaniel let out a breath. "You're hardworking, Miss Monroe, admirable, but I don't expect my employees to run themselves into the ground." Sophie shook her head vigorously. "I love my job, sir. I was just trying to keep up, and I guess I lost track of time." "You fell asleep in my office," he pointed out, her face twisted in embarrassment. "I know. I swear it won't happen again." Nathaniel tilted his head, his gaze locked onto hers. He had never noticed before how expressive her eyes were, how they practically gave away everything she was feeling. And maybe that was why he did something completely out of character. "Have dinner with me," he said. Sophie's mouth fell open. "What? Dinner?" he repeated smoothly. "You clearly don't take care of yourself, so consider it my way of ensuring my best employee doesn't collapse from exhaustion." Her hands clutched onto a file folder as if it were a lifeline. "I don't think that's appropriate. It's just dinner," Nathaniel said, his voice deceptively calm. "No work talk, just a meal." She stared at him, clearly wrestling with the idea. And then, finally, she sighed. One dinner. Nathaniel's lips curved slightly. He wasn't sure why this felt like a victory, but somehow he knew this was only the beginning. Sophie had no idea how she had found herself here. Seated in the private dining room of one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, she struggled to comprehend how a simple mistake falling asleep in her boss's office had led to this. Across from her, Nathaniel Pierce sat with the ease of a man who was used to commanding every room he entered. The low glow of candlelight cast sharp shadows over the chiseled angles of his face, making him look even more intimidating than usual. She swallowed hard, gripping the edge of her napkin as a server placed their first course before them. "This is unnecessary," she said, forcing herself to sound composed. "You don't have to feed me just because I overworked myself." Nathaniel leaned back, fingers grazing the rim of his wine glass. "I don't do things I don't want to do, Sophie. If I thought this was unnecessary, we wouldn't be here." She hesitated at the sound of her name. He rarely used it, always Miss Monroe, and always in that clipped, professional tone. But here, in this setting, it felt different. "Still," she pressed, "you don't usually take your employees out to dinner." His lips curled slightly. "And you don't usually fall asleep in my office." Her face burned at the reminder, and she dropped her gaze to the delicate dish in front of her. "I don't make a habit of it, I promise." "Good," he said smoothly. "Though I have to admit, it was a first for me too, finding someone so comfortable in my space." Sophie glanced up sharply, catching something unreadable in his expression. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but the weight of his gaze unnerved her. "You don't like people in your space?" she asked, trying to steer the conversation away from herself. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "I prefer control over my surroundings." That much she already knew. Working for him these past 2 weeks had shown her how meticulous he was, how every detail of his company and, by extension, his life was curated to perfection. "And yet you didn't wake me up immediately," she pointed out. His fingers drummed lightly against the table. "No, I didn't." Her breath hitched just slightly at the way he said it, like he was considering something deeper than the surface of the conversation. But before she could dwell on it, he switched topics. "You work late often," he observed, "even when there's no need." She lifted a shoulder. "I like to be prepared for the next day." "And yet you overextend yourself," he countered. "That kind of dedication is admirable, but it can also be reckless." Sophie frowned. "I'm not reckless." Nathaniel tilted his head, studying her. "You push yourself beyond what's necessary." "That's reckless in its own way." She looked down at her plate, cutting a small bite of her meal. "If I don't push myself, then I won't succeed." His voice dropped slightly. "And why is success so important to you?" She hesitated. That was a question she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. But there was something about his gaze, the way he seemed genuinely interested, that made her speak. "I've worked hard to get where I am," she admitted. "Nothing was handed to me. I had to fight for every opportunity, and I don't take any of it for granted." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, as if weighing her words. Then he said, "I can respect that." There was no condescension in his tone, no empty platitude, just a simple statement, one that somehow made Sophie's chest tighten. She cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. "And what about you? What about me? You built your company from the ground up," she said. "Everyone knows that, but why? You already came from money, didn't you?" Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Coming from money doesn't mean anything unless you make something of yourself. "I wasn't interested in inheriting someone else's legacy. I wanted to build my own." Sophie considered that. It made sense. He wasn't the kind of man who would settle for living in someone else's shadow. He had to be in control, had to create something that was his and his alone. And for the first time, she realized that maybe, in some ways, they weren't so different. A comfortable silence stretched between them as they continued their meal. Sophie found herself relaxing, despite knowing that this was far from a normal situation. She was having dinner with her boss, a man who was as untouchable as he was powerful, and yet, here they were, talking like two people who weren't separated by status or wealth. As the evening wore on, Nathaniel surprised her. He wasn't just the ruthless CEO she had come to know at work. He had layers depth beneath the carefully curated exterior. But just as she was starting to feel at ease, reality came crashing back. As they were leaving the restaurant, stepping out into the cool night air, a voice called out, "Nathaniel Pierce." "Over here." The flash of cameras erupted, reporters swarming in an instant. Sophie's stomach dropped. She wasn't used to this, the blinding lights, the shouting, the invasive questions. Nathaniel immediately stepped in front of her, shielding her from the chaos. His presence was commanding, his voice low and firm as he addressed the press. No comments tonight. But the reporters weren't deterred. "Who's the woman with you?" one of them demanded. "A new romance, Mr. Pierce." Sophie stiffened. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He placed a protective hand on the small of her back, guiding her toward the waiting car. "That's none of your concern." The door shut behind them, cutting off the noise. Sophie exhaled sharply, her pulse racing. "Are you okay?" Nathaniel asked, his voice softer now. She turned to him, shaking her head. "I don't belong in your world." His jaw tightened. "You belong wherever you choose to be." The words sent a shiver through her, but she didn't respond, because deep down she knew this was dangerous. And yet she wasn't sure if she wanted to walk away. Sophie sat in the back of the sleek black car, her pulse still unsteady from the chaos outside the restaurant. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, but she barely noticed them. Her mind was stuck on the way Nathaniel had shielded her, the way he had spoken so firmly to the reporters, the way his touch had lingered just long enough to leave an impression. She shouldn't feel this way. She shouldn't be sitting in the back of a billionaire's car, feeling the weight of his presence beside her, sensing the unspoken tension in the air. But she was. Nathaniel was silent beside her, his expression unreadable as he stared out the window. His jaw was tight, and for the first time she sensed something in him that wasn't just control or confidence, it was frustration. Maybe even something deeper. She exhaled, trying to steady herself. "That was insane." His gaze shifted to her immediately, sharp and assessing. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. "I didn't expect that." "You wouldn't," he said simply. "This isn't your world." She bit the inside of her cheek, hating how true that was, and yet I somehow got pulled into it. Nathaniel didn't respond right away. He studied her as if weighing something in his mind. Then, finally, he spoke. "I should have anticipated the press would be watching. That was a mistake on my part." Sophie frowned. "You make mistakes." The corner of his mouth twitched, but there was no humor in his expression. "Occasionally." The intensity in his gaze made her stomach tighten. She looked away, focusing on the city outside instead. "Well, I don't want to be dragged into your headlines. I work for you, Nathaniel, that's all." A muscle in his jaw flexed. "Is it?" She turned back to him, startled by his tone. "What else would it be?" His eyes darkened slightly, and for a moment she thought he might say something reckless, something that would change everything between them. But then the car slowed, pulling up in front of her apartment building. Nathaniel didn't move, neither did she. The air between them was thick with something unsaid, something dangerous. But Sophie knew better than to let herself believe in something that wasn't real. She reached for the door handle. "Thank you for dinner," and she hesitated, searching for the words. "For handling that situation." Nathaniel's fingers drummed against his knee. "It won't happen again." Something about the way he said it sent a pang through her chest. She nodded, pushing the feeling away. Then she stepped out of the car without looking back. Nathaniel sat in his office the next morning, staring at the reports on his desk without really seeing them. He was distracted by her, by the way she had looked at him in the car. By the way she had walked away last night, as if putting distance between them was the only logical choice. It irritated him. He wasn't a man who let things get under his skin. He had built his company on discipline, on controlling every variable. But Sophie Monroe was proving to be a variable he hadn't accounted for. His intercom buzzed and his assistant's voice came through. "Mr. Pierce, Miss Monroe is here with the updated reports." He straightened, his expression smoothing into its usual impassive mask. "Send her in." The door opened, and Sophie stepped inside, carrying a neatly organized stack of files. She looked composed, professional, completely unaffected by the events of the previous night. Except he knew better now, she wasn't unaffected, she was just good at pretending. She placed the files on his desk, her posture rigid. "Everything is updated as per your request." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "You didn't have to do all of this so early." She lifted her chin slightly. "It's my job." There it was again, that insistence on keeping things strictly professional, but he wasn't sure he wanted that anymore. "Sophie," he said, his voice quieter now. "About last night," she cut him off before he could finish. "It was a mistake." His jaw tightened. "Was it?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her notepad. "Yes." "It can't happen again." Something in Nathaniel's chest twisted. He wasn't used to hearing no, wasn't used to people walking away from him, especially when he wasn't ready to let them go. He exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Understood." Sophie relaxed just slightly, too soon. "That doesn't mean I'm going to ignore it," he added. Her eyes snapped to his, startled. "Nathaniel, I don't make a habit of pursuing things that have no value," he said, "but I don't walk away from something important either." She swallowed, her throat working. "I'm not important." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "You're wrong." For the first time since she had entered the room, she looked shaken. Good, because he wasn't letting this go easily. Nathaniel didn't believe in fate. He believed in decisions, in control, in shaping outcomes with deliberate precision. And yet, as he watched Sophie standing before him in his office, her hazel eyes wide with something caught between uncertainty and defiance, he felt as if something greater than logic had brought them to this moment. He had spent his entire career ensuring that emotions never dictated his choices. That line had always been clear. Until her. Sophie looked ready to argue, to insist once again that what had happened between them meant nothing. But before she could, the office phone rang, sharp and insistent. She flinched slightly at the interruption, breaking the spell between them. Exhaling, she stepped back. "You should get that," she murmured, her voice carefully neutral. Nathaniel let the moment slip away, but not before giving her a look that promised this conversation was far from over. He picked up the receiver, his tone clipped. "What is it?" The voice on the other end belonged to his head of PR. "We have a problem." Nathaniel's jaw locked. "Explain." "There's speculation about last night. Articles are already circulating, questioning your relationship with Miss Monroe." His grip on the phone tightened. He should have expected this. The media never missed an opportunity to turn nothing into something, but this wasn't nothing. Sophie was still in the room, pretending to focus on her tablet, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. She had heard every word. Nathaniel ended the call and set the phone down with deliberate slowness. "They're making assumptions," he said, watching her closely. Sophie let out a quiet breath. "Of course they are." He could hear it in her voice, the resignation. The belief that this was just another example of why they couldn't be anything more than employer and employee. But Nathaniel had never accepted limitations. "They'll keep speculating," he said, "and if we deny it, they'll only dig deeper." Her gaze snapped to his. "So what are you suggesting?" He leaned back in his chair, considering his next words carefully. "We don't deny it." Sophie froze. "You want them to think we're together?" "I don't want to lie," he corrected. "I just don't see the point in pretending this isn't happening." Her lips parted in shock. "Nathaniel, this is real," he finished for her. Her breath caught, but she shook her head. "This isn't a solution. It's only going to make things worse." His expression remained unreadable. "For who?" "For both of us," she said, her voice softer now. "You have an empire to protect, I have my career to think about. And if people believe I got this job because of—" She stopped herself, looking away. Nathaniel's patience snapped. "Because of what?" She swallowed hard, then met his gaze. "Because of you." The weight of her words settled between them, heavy and unspoken until now. He understood what she wasn't saying. That no matter how capable, how hard she worked, People would always assume she hadn't earned her place beside him. Something inside him hardened. If anyone questions your position here, they're fools, and if they dare to say it to your face, they'll no longer have a place in this company. Sophie let out a short, disbelieving laugh. You can't just shut down every rumor, Nathaniel. He stood suddenly, rounding the desk until he was standing directly in front of her. She didn't back away, but he saw the way her breath hitched. I can do whatever I want, he said, his voice a low murmur, and what I want is you. Sophie's entire body went still. He had never been a man who played games. He didn't dance around feelings or waste time with uncertainty. If she expected him to retreat, to let her pretend this was nothing, she was going to be disappointed. Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Nathaniel reached out, his fingers ghosting over the sleeve of her blouse. Tell me you don't feel this, he said. Tell me you don't want this, and I'll stop. Sophie's breathing was uneven, her pulse visible at the base of her throat. It doesn't matter what I want. That's not an answer. She hesitated, her resolve wavering, and for the first time Nathaniel saw something break through her control. Fear. Not of him, but of what this meant. I don't know how to do this, she whispered, his chest tightened. Then let me show you. She looked up at him, and something shifted between them, something unstoppable. And then she was in his arms, her fingers curling against his shirt as he pulled her close. Nathaniel Pierce had built his life on control. But when he kissed Sophie Monroe, he let it all go. The taste of her lingered on his lips, a mix of warmth and hesitation. Nathaniel had kissed women before countless times in different places, under different circumstances. But never like this. Never with a feeling that clawed at his chest, demanding more than just the moment. Sophie was frozen in his arms, her fingers still gripping the fabric of his shirt. He could feel the tension in her frame, the way her breath came in uneven waves, but she wasn't pulling away. Not yet. Then, as if reality crashed into her all at once, she took a sharp step back, breaking the contact. Her eyes were wide, her lips still slightly parted. This can't happen, she whispered. Nathaniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay collected. It already did. She shook her head, her hands curling into fists at her sides. That was a mistake. His patience frayed. Was it? Sophie's gaze darted to the floor, as if looking at him too long would unravel her completely. I work for you. This, she gestured between them, her voice tight. This isn't part of the job. Nathaniel exhaled through his nose, his frustration mounting. You think I don't know that? Then why are you making this harder? His fingers twitched at his sides, aching to reach for her again. Because I don't believe in pretending. She closed her eyes briefly, as if steadying herself. When she opened them again, there was a new kind of resolve there. You don't have to pretend anything. But I do, Nathaniel's brows furrowed. What does that mean? She hesitated, then sighed. I've worked too hard to get here to be taken seriously. And now, because of one dinner and some overzealous reporters, people are going to think I'm just another woman who got close to you for the wrong reasons. His expression darkened. I don't care what people think. Sophie let out a humorless laugh. That's easy for you to say. You're the billionaire, the CEO, your reputation can take the hit. Mine can't. Something in her voice struck him harder than he expected. He had spent years building his empire, making decisions without concern for outside judgment. But Sophie wasn't in the same position. If people whispered about her, if they questioned her credibility, it could affect everything she had worked for. He hated that she was right. Nathaniel stepped back, his muscles coiled with restraint. So what do you want, Sophie? For us to pretend this never happened. She hesitated, and for the briefest second he saw the war waging inside her, then her shoulders squared. Yes, his jaw tightened. Fine. Sophie flinched at the clipped tone, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked toward the door, her movements hurried, as if staying any longer would undo her decision. Nathaniel watched her go, a storm brewing in his chest. She thought this was over. She was wrong. The following days passed in a blur of tension. Sophie kept her distance, throwing herself into work with a ruthless efficiency that left no room for personal interactions. Nathaniel let her, but it didn't mean he had stopped watching. He noticed the way her hands trembled slightly when she handed him reports, the way her voice faltered when she spoke directly to him. She was affected, just as much as he was. And it was driving him mad. By the end of the week, he had had enough. When Sophie entered his office with a stack of documents, he stood abruptly, rounding his desk before she could even finish speaking. "Close the door," he ordered. She blinked, caught off guard. Now." Something in his voice made her obey without further argument. The door clicked shut, sealing them inside. Nathaniel didn't waste time. "This isn't working." Sophie crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "I don't know what you mean." He took a step closer, invading her space. "Yes, you do." Her breath hitched, but she held her ground. "You agreed to forget about it." "I lied." Her eyes widened slightly. "Nathaniel, no," he interrupted. "You don't get to decide this alone." She exhaled sharply, frustration laced in every motion. "I'm trying to be responsible. And I'm trying to be honest." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything unspoken. Finally, Sophie let out a shaky breath. If we do this, it won't be simple." Nathaniel's lips curved slightly. "I don't do simple." She searched his face, looking for something, maybe reassurance, maybe an excuse to keep fighting. But in the end, she found only determination. Something in her gave way. "I don't either," she admitted softly. That was all the confirmation he needed. This time, when he kissed her, she didn't pull away. Sophie had always thought of herself as someone who made careful, rational choices. She planned, she analyzed, she never let emotions dictate her actions. And yet, here she was, tangled in something that defied logic, something that had started with a single kiss and had unraveled every carefully laid boundary she had built. Nathaniel wasn't a man who did anything halfway. Now that the door between them had been opened, he wasn't hesitating. He was relentless in the way he pursued her, not with grand proclamations or empty words, but with presence. With the way he made her feel as if she was the only thing that had ever held his attention. And that terrified her. She had spent the past few days caught between the pull of what she wanted and the fear of what it would mean. But Nathaniel wasn't giving her space to run. His gaze lingered when they were in meetings, his touch was deliberate when he brushed past her, and his voice was quieter when he spoke her name, as if it was something only meant for him to say. And she was crumbling under it. Tonight, she found herself in a place she had never expected, standing in Nathaniel's penthouse, surrounded by a world so far removed from her own that it felt surreal. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a sprawling view of the city, the lights twinkling like stars against the dark sky. Everything about his home was sleek, modern, and impossibly luxurious, but it wasn't the wealth that unsettled her. It was the intimacy of being here in his space, with no walls left between them. Nathaniel watched her from across the room, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored slacks. "You're overthinking again," she let out a breath, crossing her arms. "I don't know how not to." A small smirk tugged at his lips, but his eyes were serious. "Then let me make it simple for you." He took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth of him, the quiet intensity that had always made it impossible to ignore him. "I want you," he said, his voice low and certain, "and I know you want this too." Sophie's pulse raced. "It's not that easy." Nathaniel reached out, brushing his fingers along the curve of her jaw, tilting her face up to him. "It could be." She swallowed, torn between the instinct to protect herself and the undeniable truth that she had already fallen. She had fought against this for so long, convinced that it was reckless, that it would ruin everything she had worked for. But standing here, with Nathaniel looking at her as if she was the only thing in his world that mattered, she realized something. It was already too late. She had never been able to resist him. Not really. So she stopped trying. Nathaniel saw the moment she surrendered. The uncertainty in her eyes melted into something else, something just as intense as the fire burning in his own chest. And when she reached for him, pulling him down into a kiss that left no room for doubt, he knew there was no turning back. The world outside didn't matter. The rules she had tried to impose on them didn't matter. All that mattered was this, her, them. And this time there would be no running away. Sophie hadn't expected love to feel like this. She had thought it would be something gradual, something that made sense, something she could control. But loving Nathaniel was nothing like that. It was consuming, overwhelming. It was the kind of love that changed things, that left nothing the same. And as much as she had feared it, she couldn't imagine a world where she didn't have it. Nathaniel had made it clear from the beginning he wasn't a man who let go of what he wanted. And now she understood why, because neither was she. Their relationship wasn't easy. There were challenges, moments where doubt crept in, where the outside world threatened to pull them apart. But every time, Nathaniel was there, steady and unwavering, reminding her that they were in this together. And Sophie, she was done fighting what had always been inevitable. In the end, love wasn't about logic or careful planning. It was about taking the risk. And she had never been more certain that Nathaniel Pierce was worth it.